Alright folks, here is a Tough Torque K46 hydrostatic transmission. What I'm going to do is I'm going to strip it down completely, show you guys all the components in there, what everything does. I'm also going to show what components typically wear. And before we start tearing it apart, I will show you guys the things on the outside of the transmission and what they do. This is a disengagement lever. If you pull this lever backwards, and I will demonstrate, I'll show this on the inside as well, but when you pull this lever backwards, what it does is it moves the motor housing away from the motor cylinder body, and it allows the fluid to bypass so that you can actually turn the wheels on the tractor so you can roll it. I have a tractor right here so I can demonstrate that. So we've got this lever on the back here, and if I try to roll the transmission right now, it takes quite a bit of force. But if I pull this lever out, the transmission rolls back and forth quite easily. And this little lever is hooked up to this arm right here. All right, next we have the forward reverse. Some of them use a hand stick, and you push forward, pull back, and some sort of linkage moves this forward or backward. This particular tractor uses a foot pedal for forward and reverse, but some of them just have a handle up here, and you can actually see where they have a place to put one of those handles if it's that model of tractor. Right here we have the brake lever. And when you move this, there's actually a brake disc on the motor output, and it grabs the brake disc and stops the whole transmission. So this is a park brake style system. It's not intended for braking for going down hills or anything like that. So I've already removed the pulley, which is driven by a belt. This is the input on the transmission, so your motor or your engine on your tractor would turn this shaft. This is a fan that sits on top of it to blow cooling air down over the transmission to keep it cool. And these are the axles. Alright, now that we have the cover removed, we get our first look inside the transmission. If we take a quick look over here, we can see the input shaft. That's the input shaft going into the transmission. That's where the pulley and the fan mount on. So if we follow that straight through here, it comes up underneath this body, and inside of there is the pump. The pump is rotated by the engine, and then when you move your drive lever, which is here, it pumps fluid either forward or backward through this, which is the motor, this body here. So coming out of the motor, we have a shaft with the primary gear and brake disc on it. Next up, we have a jack shaft or intermediate gear. This reduces the speed and increases the torque. And then here we have our differential, which is attached to the axles and allows one wheel to turn at a time to give you some slippage while you're driving around a corner. So just to open up the area, make other stuff easier to see and make it easier to work on, I'm going to pull out the differential, the axles, and the jack shaft before I tackle the motor and the pump assembly. The disassembly of these is fairly easy. There's a few retainers here. You pull out retainer, slide the axle part way out. There's a second retainer that also just slides out. And once that is done, the axle will slide out of the bearing, which is here, and just pull right out of the transmission. You have to be careful not to damage the seals if you're going to use it again. We'll do that exact same thing on this side. I can probably do this with my fingers. We got that retainer out, slide the axle out a little bit, turn the axle and let that retainer fall out, if it will. Hopefully it will. No, it's not gonna. Alright, well, we'll pull it out the top then. There we go, we got our second retainer out, which means the axle will now slide out. I'll take it out carefully, not to damage the seal. So now we'll slide out the differential as one unit. You can see there are lots of different gears and pins and stuff in here, so we'll just keep this all together as an assembly for now. Set it over there. And now we have the bearings, which just slide out of the case. I'll set them over here. And now we have the jack shaft, or intermediate shaft. So far there's not any indications of a massive amount of wear. The transmission actually looks to be in fairly decent shape. So we'll move along and see if we can pick out what the problem is. If we have a look here, we can see that there's a magnet which is used to collect metal filings, and it has a lot of shmoo built up on it. Now this is kind of interesting. I took apart a transmission in one of my last videos, which was off of this tractor here. If you go back and look at that video, you will notice that there were a lot more magnets in the case. There was this one, but there were also two on the pump and one somewhere else. I don't recall exactly where, but got all the bolts out. Now we'll just do a little bit of prying and this whole thing will pop out. Very careful, gentle prying, but prying nonetheless. And we're almost there. Hopefully it doesn't pop out with too much of a violent pop. Almost there. There we go. And it's ready to come out. So first we'll pull off the primary drive gear and we'll set that aside. You can see this is the brake disc as well. It's got the brake disc built onto it. It's splined on the inside. That fits up to the motor output. We'll just set that aside. And then we'll pull the rest of it out, and for now we'll slide this case back a little bit out of our way. So here we have the motor output shaft, which will slide out, and when it does slide out it will reveal this thrust bearing or thrust plate, which is angled. This is a fixed angle, it doesn't change. It's always that same angle. I'm not sure of the exact names of these, but I'm going to call this the cylinder body of the motor. And what it does, it has all these pistons on here, and hydraulic pressure is fed from the back side through the body, through these holes. And as the oil is fed through, it pushes the pistons out, and when it does that, it pushes them against this angled plate, which causes the motor to rotate. In turn, that causes the motor output shaft to rotate. I'll explain this a little further down the video, but for now, that's the explanation, and we'll just set the motor aside. and take a look at the pump body, this little pin here fits in that hole right there. And if you remember back in the video, I was talking about pulling the lever on the transmission, and when you did, it made it easier to roll the tractor. When you pull that lever on the back of the tractor, it rotates this shaft. And when that shaft gets rotated, you see there's a flat on it. And that flat pushes against the pin from in here. That shaft sits in there, like so. And it pushes out on the pin, and when it pushes out on the pin, it pushes the motor body away just slightly and allows the fluid to bypass. If we look into the case here, we can see the pump. And the pump is basically just a little bit smaller version of the motor. The difference is, when we pull it out here, we can see that the pump, get some of this oil out of it. So we have the pump and we have the motor, and you can see the pump is a little bit smaller than the motor. The only real difference other than size is that the pump sits on this thrust bearing, which doesn't sit at a fixed angle. So if we remember, the motor sits on this plate, which sits at a fixed angle, and the pump sits on this plate. And if we take and have a look on the outside of the transmission, this is the lever that attaches to your foot pedal. So this is what moves back and forth when you go forward reverse with your foot pedal. And if we take a look back on the inside, we have a thrust bearing here, but this thrust bearing right now is sitting perfectly flat. Now because it's sitting perfectly flat, when the input shaft rotates, none of these pistons are moving up and down. It's rotating on a flat surface, and none of the pistons are moving in or out. When we rotate the plate, so when we put it in forward, we rotate that plate, and what it does is one side of the pistons extend and one side retract. So one side of the pistons get pushed in and the other side of the pistons get let out. So we can see it rotates along the center axis, and we have part of the plate is going away from us and part of the plate is coming towards us. So now as we rotate the input shaft, these pistons are getting forced into the bore of the body, like so, and some of them are getting pushed out by the springs. In order for the transmission to reverse, the plate is simply rotated in the opposite direction. So we have our forward direction and our reverse direction that are simply controlled by the angle of the plate. Right now we have it sitting at 0 degrees. We rotate a little bit one way, rotate it a little bit the other way, and that is our forward and reverse.